Good afternoon, friends. What could be more civilized than a cup of tea in the middle of a beautiful garden and conversations about one of the most incredible books I've read in the last 2 years. It was a sweeping saga. It was a story that talks about the intersection of science, history, and how we mere mortals negotiate this path through all of that. And personally, it was like a homecoming because it spoke about Kerala and a part of Kerala, the landscape of which was very, very, for me, it was an emotional journey to go back. So thank you, Abraham, for writing this book and for coming to Kolkata to discuss it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. It's my first trip here, many firsts, including I don't think I've ever had tea on stage. So
have you had any other beverage?
This is perfect, thank you.
All right, so the book starts off in Parambil, and this is a story which has a story behind it, which Abraham speaks about at the back of the book. So talk us through that little conversation between a niece and her grandmother about her childhood and her time before, this young girl was born. So was that what prompted you to start this book?
Yes, when my grandmother was in her 70s, when my mother was in her 70s, and my mother was, in retrospect, an extraordinary woman. She, grew up in Kerala at the age of 25 with a physics degree. About the time of independence, she saw an ad for a teaching position in Ethiopia. And she had to look that up on a map. She had no idea where it was. And can you imagine a single woman in the 40s in a sari heading by ship to Aden and then onward to Ethiopia? But she did, and met my father, who was also from Kerala, a teacher, coming there. And, she had a very active life in Ethiopia and then taught again in America and eventually retired in her 70s in Florida. And my niece, who is a namesake of my mother, when she was 5 years old, my niece said to my mother, "Amachi, what was it like when you were 5 years old?" And my mother was just taken aback by that question. How does she begin to capture for this young girl what her life was like in Kerala, before electricity, before running water? Not that these were deprivations by any means. And so my mother, rather than trying to answer, began to write longhand in a school book. And it's a wonderful document that's beautifully illustrated just for her niece, just for her granddaughter. And that manuscript has become sort of a treasure in the family, as you can imagine. And when I finished cutting for stone, I was fishing around for another topic for a novel. So Cutting for Stone was set in Ethiopia, where I was born, and I was very familiar and fluent with the geography, the people, the language. Kerala was a place I was very familiar with because every single summer we went there for 2 months, and much later I went to medical school in South India. Nevertheless, I hesitated because, I wasn't a native. I wasn't someone who was born there and knew all the little rituals. But I picked up Mom's manuscript all over again for some reason around that time, and I just suddenly realized there was so much richness in those stories, so much of interest in our little community, relatively little compared to the other religious groups around, to have this small Christian enclave in Kerala. And I decided that that's where I'm going to set the story. By this time, Mom was in her 90s, and she was absolutely thrilled that I was setting the story in Kerala, and she became my #1 researcher. Even a few days before she died, she called me up to give me yet another anecdote that she remembered. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that she told me the same anecdote the day before, you know. So sadly, Mom passed away before she saw the finished book, but you know, I really believe that she's up there watching over it, because it certainly had some magical things happen to it that I'm not responsible for directly. Just, you have to have a lot of lucky breaks, and I think I had a lot of great breaks with this book.
That's beautiful. And, you know, there's a scene in the book right at the start where a doctor is told by his nurse that, you know, it's exactly what you were doing back home, and the pathology is magnified in India. So in that sense, from Cutting for Stone to The Covenant of Water, was the canvas a little more challenging? You had these two parallel stories, you had characters who were coming into the story, some who are so good that you could have fan fiction about them later, because there's a Joppan who's an incredible character, there's a Lenin, and there are several others who are just action master. Yes, so Uplift Master, yes, who is that's one of the best scenes of the book. So, you know, the pathology had to be magnified in a way in this book as well.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, that phrase, the pathology is magnified, is something that I love using, because it's so true. I mean, you bring the average physician from America or UK to practice here, and, you know, they're just not used to hernias that we classify in the textbooks as direct or indirect hernias. In India or Africa, you classify it as below the knee or above the knee, you know, because they can be pretty huge. But yeah, I think I set out to write a story that encompassed several generations, because I really wanted to be able to introduce a genetic disorder in the first generation and have it be a bit of a mystery and have it solved by the third generation. And to do that, you really needed a fairly big canvas. And also, it's such an interesting time in Indian history, 1900 to 1976. You know, you have two world wars in which, you know, Indians provided the bulk of the British Army, one could say. And you have the emancipation of India finally after centuries of colonization. You have tremendous medical advances. And so I found it just a treasure trove of a time period in which to set a story. But as you say, the challenge was to not let it get too big, not let it get too out of hand. And that was a real challenge, but it was a lot of fun too. I enjoyed myself.
So coming to that, as I mentioned to you in the lounge, I have noticed over the last few years of reading a lot of historical fiction that they can be paralleled with paintings and art. So there are some which have the whole landscape, which is so overpowering that the protagonists in the painting seem small, and it is the sweep of the background or the history that kind of prevails over the minutiae of each character. Then you have a painting like, say, the Impressionists, where you see the protagonist, but there is a very significant presence of the background. But your book, sir, is like a children's pop-up book where there is the background, but the protagonists are so front and center that you are swept by their story as much, or much more actually, than the time they're living through. So that's quite an unusual way of looking at history and fiction, so congratulations for that. And was it hard to achieve that?
You know, I don't think I set out to, by the way, that's a beautiful metaphor. I love that, the metaphor of the painting. But I don't think I necessarily set out to accomplish just that. I do believe that, for me, geography is a character. It's a major decision to set a story in a particular geography. There's a very famous quote by Napoleon that geography is destiny. And I mean, I think he was speaking about France's position in the world. But on a very personal level, my parents couldn't find jobs in India at the time, 1940s, and they changed their geography and it changed their destiny, as a result of which I was born in Africa, and that completely changed my destiny compared to theirs. So I'm very, very conscious of geography, perhaps even more so because I was in the middle of medical school in Africa. The Civil War broke out, and I was displaced from the land of my birth, the place I thought of as home. And it was a very dislocating moment for me. And so having to relinquish your geography, relinquish your home, relinquish the language you're so fluent in, was very dislocating and made me much more conscious of how grounding and important geography is. I'm always envious of people like many of you here who can trace your roots to one family house in Kolkata, and generations have lived there, and you know the neighbors, and you have a wealth of history embedded in the soil right there. I've never had that luxury, and so on the one hand, as a writer, it's perhaps an advantage. I'm a perennial outsider looking in, but I can't help feeling a sense of envy. So when I do write a novel, I think I'm very conscious of the geography as being a character for me. This same story set somewhere else would not be the same story by any means. But I certainly wasn't thinking about Monet or pop-up books when I was constructing it. But thank you for that, such a generous statement.
The other part of the book which is really amazing is the two strands that make the story. So you have Digby and you have the Parambil, a big Ammachi strand. So that's another myth that a lot of millennials would think, that it is only now that India has become truly international and we are a shrinking world. But you had these people like the Dr. Roon character, like Digby, two doctors actually, who came to India, one with a calling, so to speak, and the other one who just wanted to run away from his geography, actually. And then you have the Parambil strand. So, you know, the whole construction of the novel between these two strands and how the characters occasionally, you know, collide, converge, and then part. How hard was it to, you know, when I was reading it, I found it very, very easy to navigate. But several people lost the strand and would go back and, you know, come back. And that was also a way of discovering how international India was back then as well, beyond the colonial story.
Yeah, I think you're getting at the heart of it. I think if you're writing with some authenticity about 1900 to 1970, the early part of that century, you know, it's impossible to write about India or about medicine in India without acknowledging the fact that this was a colonial occupation, that the medical schools, the first medical school in India was right here. The second one was in Madras. And these were totally dominated by expatriate physicians. The first planters were all expatriates. So you really can't write the story without being true to the times. And so I was obliged to have those characters. In fact, I had a reporter in India ask me if I had put in these white characters in order to cater to the Western readers. And I said, well, first of all, this is true to the times. You know, we were living in a colonially occupied country. And secondly, what do you mean by the Western reader? You and I are having this dialogue in English, which you're going to publish in an English language magazine. And the great majority of my readers are in the West, with a smaller fraction in the Commonwealth. So I'm writing in the best way I know for the common reader. But yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't so much a deliberate choice as it was trying to be true to the times. Talking about, you know, making it all come together so well, I must say,
Did you have a map somewhere?
I wish I had a map. You know, the last book I wrote, Cutting for Stone, I took about 8 years. And when I was done and the book was out, I told myself, you know, the next time I'm really going to plan the whole story so that when I start, I'll be way ahead. And so I had a very elaborate whiteboard that occupied almost the whole of my living room, which I had taken over to make my study since I lived alone at the time. And I had this elaborate story laid out. And then I began to write, and, you know, I would come to these branch points in the story, and suddenly the characters would dictate that I should go another way. There's a saying, an aphorism in writing, that character is determined by decisions taken under pressure. It's actually true of life as well. Character is determined by decisions taken under pressure. And I would put my character under pressure, and all of a sudden I'd realize they're not going to do this thing. They're going to do something completely different. So then I would photograph the whiteboard and start all over again from this new branch point. And, you know, I'm really wish I could have an outline that explained it all. But there was a certain point in the story about, I would say, 7 years in, when I suddenly could see the ending, and now I could just go back and make everything fit well. And I wish it didn't have to be that inefficient. I'm a friend of John Irving, who's been a mentor to me, and John says to me and has said to me that, Abraham, you have to know the whole story. You have to know what you're going to show above the table and what you're going to hide under the table and when you're going to bring it out. And if you are not going to do that, if you don't know the whole story, and mind you, he knows the first and last line of every chapter before he begins. He knows the first and last line of the book before he begins. And he says, Abraham, if you don't know the whole story, if you're just making it up as you go along, then Abraham, you're not a writer. You're just an ordinary liar. You know? But then I actually asked the same question to Michael and Danche. They both live in the same town. I happen to know them both. And I told Michael what John had said to me. I was interviewing him on stage. And Michael laughed and he said, you know, I think we all eventually arrive at the same point where we know everything. John does a lot of the hard work ahead of time. And I think many of us, there's a whole camp of writers, I suspect, who have to flounder along, spend 6 months in the wrong direction, hundreds of pages, not knowing it's the wrong direction, and then backtrack and find our way. So forgive me, that was a long-winded answer.
No, that's fine. That's also a bit of wonderful, eloquent floundering. So I wanted to find out, how long did this novel take? And you had a kind of template with your mother's reminiscences. So how was the structure for this? Again, 7 years?
So this book took 14 years between this book and the previous book. And I would say about 10 or 12 of those years were spent trying to work on this book. But I mean, I think I'm incredibly lazy. This is not something people really know. And I think research is a wonderful excuse not to write. You know, I could be researching for the next decade.
I can imagine just how lazy a person working in Stanford, writing 700-page books, and also being an advocate for, you know, hand-holding, bedside, well-mannered doctors. I can imagine how lazy you are.
Well,
sure.
you know, but I will say, I mean, this is going to sound strange, but as much as I've loved the success of my previous book, I wasn't in any burning hurry to produce another book. And I think one of the great joys of being in a profession that I love, I mean, I absolutely love it. Never meant to be a writer, just a long story of how it happened, but I love my day job. And so anything that happens with the writing is gravy. It's fun. And so don't get me wrong, I wanted my books to do well and be successful, but I have a lot of writer friends who write full-time. And everything is riding on the next book. Their college tuition for their kids, their you know, the next payments for their car. And I had the luxury of really being able to take my time to get it right. That said, I don't think anybody should take 14 years to write a book, so I have no excuse for that.
There is also the medical, you know, the two practitioners, in fact, three in a way, who dominate the story. And yet you have so many magical characters. You have the spirit of Jojo's mother. You have the undying Damo, the elephant, who pretty much lives through the story. So how did you reconcile the science of the protagonists with the magic of their imaginations and their, you know, the spirits who also inhabit this novel and are real characters at times?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and I've been asked whether, you know, I was engaging in magical realism. You know, am I trying to do a Marquez kind of thing with the ghosts and spirits? But to be honest, I was really invoking the time of my grandmother, who I remember very vividly, both grandmothers. And for them, these were concrete things. I mean, they would talk about spirits and ghosts in the most concrete way. Similarly, their religion wasn't something abstract. I mean, their faith was as solid as this table here. I mean, you could really rest something on it. So I think in speaking of spirits in such a concrete way, and speaking of their faith so concretely, as opposed to an ephemeral belief system, I was simply being true to their times. I wasn't trying for some gimmick or some effect. I mean, obviously, Damodaran, the elephant, is a bit of a leap, but not much. I think there's something very unique and appealing about elephants, such a large mammal, and yet an eye that is so human-like if you look into it, and gestures of the trunk in that one single extremity or proboscis, whatever you classify it as. There's so many subtle human gestures that you can't help, in a way, as an anthropologist there who's going to help me say this, but you know what I mean. You give it human elements. You Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the word. Thankfully, I can use a dictionary and look it up. I'm usually not on stage trying to come up with it.
The other journey that happens is that of women. So we start with a 12-year-old bride who has no agency. Her mother is completely at the mercy of her brother-in-law. And by the end of it, you have the last, I don't want to let out too much of the book, but her granddaughter then comes and becomes a doctor. So plotting this journey of women, it's not that Big Ammachi didn't have agency. As she went along, she was the matriarch of the family. But her beginnings to the beginnings of her granddaughter was the sensitivity with which, the empathy with which you saw the challenges facing women. Because Kerala has this image of being extremely equal and a place where women are wanted and respected, but it is not entirely the truth all of the time. So how did you negotiate all the women who kind of populate this story?
Yeah, I believe that as a writer, my only goal has always been a good story well told. I'm really not trying to do much more than that, with the one exception. I really wanted to pay tribute to the heroic women that I knew in my life, especially my two grandmothers and my mother. I think both my grandmothers were, as many of you have people like this in your lives, heroic figures. But the kind of heroism that the world would never know. One of my grandmothers, my mother's mother, lost her only son. She had 3 daughters and a child. Lost her only son at 11 to typhoid fever. And yet she went on. She was the pillar of the family. My father's mother, my father lost his older brother. When my father was 5, his older brother was 15. His older brother chased a dog out of the compound and the dog nipped him before it left. And a month later, he died of an encephalitis, which was almost certainly rabies. And, both these women suffered unspeakable tragedy, great hardship during the world wars. And yet somehow they were the rock that not just held the family together, but held the community together. So I really set out intentionally wanting this novel to be a tribute to the kind of heroic women that I think all of us have in our lives. And yet we don't find good enough ways to celebrate them. The most daring thing I think I did with the novel, given that much of my readership is, modern readers like you, was to begin with a 12-year-old bride. You can imagine in the West, the idea of a 12-year-old bride on page 1 is enough to make you put down the book, But to tell you the truth, that was my great-grandmother's story. My great-grandmother was married at 10 to an older widower who had 2 kids. And against all the odds, it was one of the happiest marriages by all accounts. She had a couple more children. They were a rollicking, fun couple, and everybody talked about them and their interactions. And so I like the idea of playing against the grain a little bit, defying the reader's expectation that they're about to read about this terrible tragedy and abuse, and instead stumbling onto a most respectful older husband who waits for her to come of age to allow her to grow into her own. So yeah, I think it was a very conscious decision to have Big Ammachi, the grandmother, be the central figure in the story, and to have a line of strong women carry the story to its end.
And it's amazing that we never know Big Ammachi's name right till well into the 350th page, perhaps, when her granddaughter is named Mariamma after her. So I thought that was wonderful to, we knew this woman is so powerful and yet she didn't have a name of her own till that moment. So I found that very moving. The other part of the novel is the politics of the time. So there's this incredible conversation between Philippos, who's the most remarkable character in my reading of the book, because he had so many failings and yet such great redemption that it was just wonderful the way you've plotted him out. So, first let's talk about Philippos and then about his whole conversation with this playmate of his who is so disenfranchised and, so bitter about it.
Yeah, I think it was very hard to write a sweeping novel like this set in South India without acknowledging that, quite apart from the oppression of a colonial power, colonizing our land, you still had layers of casteism and people, sort of lording it over another caste below them and another caste below them. And the Christians were not exempt. I mean, we were converted to Christ supposedly by St. Thomas, but that didn't mean we allowed those of a lower caste to happily come join our sect. So I think as a child, the oddity of this struck me. I would be playing with children who would not be allowed to come inside the house. It never made sense to me. And my parents were semi-apologetic about this and tried to explain why it was so. And my grandparents absolutely could see no issue there. This is just how it is, And I think that my grandparents, maybe my parents to some degree, justified it by how well they treated the people working with them. And that struck a chord with me because that was exactly the problem with the emancipation of the slaves in America, where the kind slave owners who treated their slaves kindly were, in a way, doing the biggest kind of injustice because they were assuming that their kindness somehow made this a level playing field. And so the conversation you're referring to with Jopan and Philippos was one I labored over for a long time. I really read a lot of liberation theology and other things to help me inform what was meant to be just a conversation between two people. You asked me about Philippos, and I think of all the characters in the book, I think he is closest to me in the sense that, I think he represents someone who's well-intentioned but can't help making horrible mistakes. And I think that, he's seeking redemption. One of the critiques of my book by the New York Times, by a guy who I know pretty well, who shouldn't have reviewed the book in the first place. It was a pretty generous review, but he did say that all my characters were all nice people, that I had no villains. And, at first I took it badly, but then I sort of thought, that is the way I see the world. I mean, I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and says, I'm evil, this is what I'm going to do. Even the most misguided characters feel very justified in their own little pathology, And so somebody once asked, I think it was Lee Marvin or one of these actors who's famous for playing the bad guy, and they asked him at the end of his career, Mr. So-and-so, what is it like playing a bad guy all your life? And he said, son, I've never played a bad guy in my life. And that's just the way to do it. You have to have faith in who you are. The world may not agree, but you don't see yourself as evil, So the fact that he would say that was high praise. But I do think Philippos exemplifies the need for all of us to find redemption for some of the things that we know were boneheaded, stupid things we did earlier on, and we're all trying to make the best of it.
So before I open it out to the audience, I just have two strands to discuss. One is the medicine and, the swing in the tail, the kickback of the leprosy part of it. The story of leprosy in India and how you've actually stopped. I read about leprosy and its cure after the book, and there was a proper cure shortly after the book kind of ends. And I was just wondering if the protagonist who was suffering from it would benefit from that. So how did you research Rune and that whole journey of research and healing and these colonies that actually many of us know about in India?
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, I suspect similar to your growing up, it was commonplace to see lepers in the
It
street.
still is
It
actually in
still is.
Kolkata.
Although I must say, I've seen much less of it than ever, you know. But certainly, even when I was in medical school, it was common to see lepers in the street, lepers everywhere. But I think that as a child, especially, you know, they were sort of scary figures. They were these incredibly disfigured people, and you had this sense that everybody was a bit wary of them, and you might catch it if you get too close. And it was only when I got to medical school and sort of saw the way enlightened professors were bandaging their wounds and, you know, sort of understood the pathology that I realized that, you know, these were individuals inside, beyond the disfigured exterior, was a soulful, caring individual. And the cruelest part of the disease was not so much the disfigurement, but the way that most of us didn't recognize who was inside that body. And that they were sort of suffering a kind of ostracization solely based on their appearance. But more than that, I'm an infectious disease specialist, and leprosy has always been a fascinating disease for us because the leprosy organism manages to get inside the macrophage and live there for long periods of time with a very slowly dividing cycle. It's kind of like inviting the bank robber into the vault of the bank where he sets up residence, you know. And so the trouble with treating leprosy, and treatment was available even in that era, was that you have to treat for a long time because the organism is dividing so slowly. So I think I could not help writing about leprosy because it's a fascinating disease to me, but I think it's also a powerful backdrop to everything in that period of time. But there's another disease that I think is the dominant one in this book, which is in Kerala, which is so dominated by water, you know, 42 rivers running down from the mountain in this narrow coastal strip of territory with lakes and backwaters and a lattice work of canals. People literally can swim before they walk. And so to introduce a disease where they were fearful of water and drowned easily in water was to introduce a real anomaly in that culture. And as a longtime professor of medicine, teacher at the bedside, I always keep in my back pocket some rare diseases. Don't worry, I'm speaking metaphorically now. I keep some rare diseases, of which this was one. I would often trot it out in the form of a riddle with the medical students, you know, what disease causes inherited drowning, which is what this does. And so it was always tucked away in the back.
Von Recklinghausen disease.
Yeah, von Recklinghausen type 2, or neurofibromatosis type 2. And so I introduced this disease to the family, and I thought it was a wonderful way to parallel something that I've loved in my life, which is in my lifetime, I've witnessed diseases that just had a name in medical school go to where we had a much better understanding of a causative agent, maybe even the cellular mechanism. And then in my lifetime to get to where we have molecular treatments that can absolutely reverse this. So I wanted to capture some of that advance in medicine embodied in this one disease, this condition. So that's how that came about.
Yes, it's very remarkable because typically a saga has this recurring curse, and this does too in a way because so many are victim to it. But you have gently used the doctor in yourself to say it's not a curse, it is actually a condition, and therefore there is a scientific explanation. It's not some eerie witch-like curse that is causing it. So it's a great marriage of the author in you and the doctor in you. So I really salute you for that
Thank you. Thank
twist
you so much.
in it.
Before we get to questions, may I just mention one thing? I've been to a lot of book festivals. I've never received the kind of heartfelt letter I got from you, waxing eloquent about the book, saying I rarely interview people on stage, but I want to interview you. That letter is a keeper, and it's very, very special to be here and to be with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. So just finally, my last question is the destiny of the book. You know, Oprah praised it, and then it just got a life of its own. So how has the adulation in America been, and, you know, across the world?
Yeah, the book has done very well, but I think it's important to tell, especially aspiring writers out there, I actually was signed with another publishing house, and I was well into the book, about 9 years into the book, when during COVID, I suddenly felt that my editor wasn't reading what I was sending and was telling me to correct things that I'd already changed a long time ago. And when I called the editor on it, their reaction was to cut my advance and just react in a way that made me know that even if they published the book, they would never do it justice. And so I basically broke my contract with the publisher. And I owed them a huge amount of money that they'd given me up front based on the previous book. And now I had to take this tainted manuscript and shop around and find a new publisher. And so I was very lucky to find Grove Atlantic, a young editor, Peter Blackstock, who's half Indian, half English. He loved the story, and one of the first things he said to me was, Abraham, a book has to be as long as it needs to be, which is the opposite of what I was hearing from my other editor. And so just to get the book published was huge, was a miracle. It took me over a year to pay back what I owed the first publisher, but then to have it received so well and to be, really so successful in America and the Commonwealth, it's just all gravy. I'm just humbled by it. But it could have easily been, just a footnote to another physician trying to write who didn't succeed,
No, it is truly not that. And congratulations, it's richly deserved, whatever the book is receiving. So I think that's a great moment to now throw open the conversation. So are there any questions? No spoilers. Yes, there's a question right here.
Hello, hi, my name is Neha, and I'm so excited to finally hear you speak. My question is it because you were trying to maybe not go beyond 700 pages that you kept killing these characters off every 20 pages? There is this one part where I'm just like, wow, another one. What was going on then?
Yeah, I know. It's funny how often people bring that up as though I have some, hidden homicidal instinct in me. But honestly, once again, I was being true to the times. Death was much more common than you realize. Take the story I told you about my grandmothers. They each lost a child. And I think in general in society, I suspect we live denying mortality. I don't know if you know this, but life is a terminal condition. I hope it's not news for you, right? And maybe as a physician, I'm much more accustomed to not being in denial. I'm very aware of death. I think it's why life is so poignant, because we do die. And, a rose would not be beautiful if it never withered and died. It would be a weed. You'd be trying to find ways to get rid of roses. And so I think there's something incredibly poignant about life because we're mortal. And so I don't think I was trying to kill people off randomly. I think it was in keeping with trying to make this a poignant, tender story, true to the times. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Any other questions? There's one in front, and then I'll come back to you. Yes. You go first. You've got the mic.
Mine is not a question, but Dr. Verghese, I just wanted to thank you. Sorry.
We can hear you. It's on.
Can you hear me now? Yes. This is not a question. It's a statement I'm making to thank you, Dr. Verghese, for a man of science to be able to write so languidly and capture our attention. I have nothing but admiration. The Covenant of Water is probably one of the best books I've ever read. When is your next book? Please don't stop writing.
I wish you'd stopped with just the part about the best book you ever read. It's very hard when you finish a book after so many years and put it down to get that question, when is your next book? Because my instinct is to say, what was wrong with the last book? What do you want?
You're under pressure.
It's a fair question. I think I'm getting on in years, and I recognize I don't have 14 years to work on novels if I want to write another one. So I'm kicking around a few ideas, and hopefully I'm learning something along the way about being a little more efficient. But I still feel committed to the, writing is mysterious. It's an exploration. And you pretty much have to sort of explore the unknown on the page. And sometimes it leads you in very interesting directions. And it doesn't have a timeline. It doesn't have a check-in, check-out date. Your obligation is to get your ass in the chair regularly, right? But the output is sort of, at least for me, kind of erratic. So all I can say is the plan is one day to have another one. So thank you for that.
And there's a gentleman at the back. And then
Yeah.
we'll take one more here and we'll be done.
First of all, congratulations to Dr. Verghese, because you have, I think for the common audience, demystified a large number of diseases and biology. But as a student of biology, I wanted to ask you if you have faced this criticism that you are being too clinical because you have a science background, or if anybody has made this criticism to you. And how do you respond?
Yeah, thank you. I think readers have all kinds of responses. In fact, to me, the joy of reading is that the writer provides the words, the reader provides their imagination, and somewhere in middle space, in the reader's head, a mental movie is created. And it's unique to them, which is why when you go to the movie version of some book you liked, you're often disappointed because the character doesn't look anything like, So I know that I'm not going to please everybody. Everybody has a different take on it. But I think that getting too technical is a danger. And that's why you need to trust your editor. Your editor will tell you if it's too technical or not technical enough. I think that, there's an element to many books that are in a backdrop of a profession, like a police detective story, or a story set in aviation, like airport, or Tom Clancy setting it in the setting of missiles and tanks. I don't know anything about tanks, but I love the kind of details about armor and this and that, or about, I don't know anything about seafaring, but the Hornblower novels, I love all the details of the ships, and half of it I don't understand what it's about, but it lends a authenticity, a profluence to the narrative. So for some readers it's too much, for some it's not enough. It's what it is. I really can't do more than that. I just hope that the median is enough for most of the readers. So, but thank you for that question.
We'll just take two quickly, one here and you can answer them together. Yes.
Good evening, sir. So you mentioned that both your books, you have actually delved into your life experiences to write that, and you've brought an element of authenticity to it. So how important is it for a writer to have had such a diverse life experience to be able to write, or do you think pure imagination is good enough? What is your take on that?
We'll just take both together. You can also, or you should, yeah.
I think that...
Okay, let me take that.
The book is wonderful, of course. I have a question with your background. Your teachers were, your parents were physicists, you were in medicine. And the family you write about, as is many families in India, a child learns faith from the womb. It's ingrained. You don't have to teach the child, right? So was there a conflict, internal conflict you had in tying the two together?
Okay, so...
It's kind of time.
Yeah, your question was... My memory recall is already failing me, so...
About the authenticity, you've written about,
Yeah, okay.
the places.
Yeah, I wrote 2 memoirs, My Own Country and The Tennis Partner, which were about my life in a sense. Although I started off thinking I'm writing about AIDS in a small town in Tennessee, and the second one was about doctors and drug addiction. But inevitably, I was a character since I was describing people I knew. But I think with the fiction, I don't think that there's a formula for every writer. For me, for every writer, people say, write what you know. Well, this is what I know. I know medicine, and I suppose I could write a thin, short novel or novella, but I think I'm inclined to dig deep, and I'm inclined to go deep, and so I suspect that my books tend to be on the longer side. But it's refreshing for me to pick up a writer who's written a very slim volume that blows me away, and sort of shows me what can be done in the short form. So I don't think there's any formula. I think it's very much what works for you as a writer, and hopefully works for the publisher and the reader. So you have to do whatever you're comfortable with. To answer your question about faith, I think I would disagree. I'm not sure that faith is something that you get in the womb. I actually think it's very much conditioned on your environment. And people often project on me that I must be this religious zealot and that I'm on this streak to convert readers or something like that. But again, I was trying to describe the authentic faith of my grandmothers. Belief is holding to something in the absence of proof. And they didn't need proof. They really, their belief was better than proof. And I am sometimes envious of that kind of faith. So I would not say that it's, ingrained. Certainly didn't make its way down to our generation. We're sort of naturally skeptical in a way that I don't think that they ever were. So I'm not sure what accounts for that. Maybe it's our failing that we're not. But that's the best I can answer. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Abraham. It's been wonderful. You've given us 2 beautiful sessions. Thank you for your time. Thank you, friends. Abraham would be signing books at the bookstore, and hope you're back with the next one and in between, if it's going to take that long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.